Well, good morning. It's good seeing you guys. I want to welcome those that are joining us online. So you guys worn out from running this series, right? Running. Yeah. How many of you like to run? It's that bad, huh? Goodness gracious, man. We need to get in shape around here. Well, if you're new here, my name's Jim. I'm the lead pastor here. Glad you are with us. We're in this sermon series called Running with Giants. And if you're new here, the whole premise behind this series is that we're looking at the giants of the faith that are listed in Hebrews chapter 11. There's a whole list of men and women that have gone before us. And the premise is, when we get to chapter 12, is that they are in the grandstands and they are watching, like cheering us on in our faith from when they ran their time. So it's just kind of this imagery that they're there cheering us on as we are running the race of our faith. Excuse me. With our God. And so we've covered a lot of ground in this series. We started out looking at Noah, who just waited and waited and waited. And how many just hate waiting? It was funny, just the other day, it was in the car, and my wife and I were trying to get to Aldi's, and it was like 5 till 6, and we were, about, I won't tell you how far away we were, but, it was like we were only a few, we had to get there on time, right? It's like, so we're trying to get there, and it's like, sure enough, what happens when you're in a hurry? You always get behind a slow-driving vehicle. And it was one of you, I think. No, I'm just kidding. There's a slow-driving vehicle. I'm just like, oh, my gosh, you're killing me. And it's like, well, maybe they won't turn up here. Sure enough, they turn, right? So waiting can be a challenge, right? Noah waited a long time. Then we had the ladies to share with us about Rahab and just how Rahab had to just really just embrace this new life that God just transformed her, walking away from her past, all of her failures, her sinful lifestyle, and becomes in the lineage of Jesus. Just a crazy, incredible, transforming story we see of Rahab. And then after that, we looked at Abraham, right? Abraham was known for his faith, who just waited on God, and then finally, when he's in his old age, God gives him the son of promise. And then what did God tell him to do with Isaac? You guys remember? Sacrifice him up on the mountain, which he actually didn't go through with it, but he was getting ready to, and God said, no, now I know I have your whole heart. And that's what God is after. And sometimes God will throw tests in front of us because he's after our heart more than he is our happiness, right? He's after just this fulfillment inside of us. And then after Abraham, we looked at Jacob. Roger shared with us about Jacob, right, who wrestled with God. And that's when God changed his name from Jacob to Israel, which is one who contends with God and prevails. And the things that Jacob went through, being a deceiver, all the games that he played, but then God changed his life. He could walk away from his past and embrace the future that God had for him. And then after Jacob last week, we looked at who? I don't remember either. Joseph, right? Joseph. And Joseph was just treated by his dad really special. We're talking about how, I know a lot of you, some of you were at the race. Joseph was just, the special kid that he was born in his old age. He was the second youngest and bought him this coat of many colors. And Joseph was just really kind of just trying to figure out this whole thing of these dreams that he started having. And his father scolded him. His brothers were mad at him. And he just had one terrible thing thrown at him after another, thrown to the pit. Then he ends up being a slave. Then he ends up in prison. But then he never gave up hope. God was faithful. And then he's second to the throne of Pharaoh, where he saved millions of people's lives because of his faithfulness, not letting the things of his past hold him back. So today we're going to look at another guy in this. We're going to look at a guy named Moses, right? And Moses did some incredible things for God. Moses is a big figure in the scriptures. Matter of fact, Moses gives us the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is known as the Mosaic Law. And so we're looking at if Moses were to step out of the grandstands and come down and run one lap with us, what would Moses kind of encourage us with? What can he help us with from what he's been through? And before we just kind of dive into the notes, I thought we'd just kind of take a moment and just think of some practical things Moses might say. I think something that he might say is, I would invest in a really good life jacket. Some of you are figuring that one out, all right? Because the Red Sea, right? I mean, he's standing, as he leaves Egypt, he's trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. All the power of Egypt's coming down on him. And he's like, man, and then when God parts the waters, after he steps out into the water, God parts the water and he's going through, and it'd be kind of scary, wouldn't it? With this huge wall of water. So I think Moses said, just for safety, just invest in a good life jacket or learn to swim or learn to tread water. Anyway, okay. Another thing I think he might say is, take an anger management course. right? Because there's times where Moses lost his cool, right? It cost him from going into the promised land, because one time he just got really mad at God's people, and he took his staff and he struck the rock. God told him to strike the rock so water would come out, because they were complaining there wasn't enough water. And so, instead of doing it in a godly way, he just loses his cool. And we're going to see this morning as we're looking at it, he lost his cool a number of times in his life. So I say take an anger management class, especially when it comes to dealing with people. All right, I'm in one right now. Just kidding. Anyway, third thing I think he might say is disable the recalculating function on your GPS. So I'm trying to be funny here. You guys, come on, you got to laugh. These are stupid, right? And now why would he say that? Because he was stuck in the wilderness, right? 40 years because of God's people just rebelling against God, and they just kept, recalculating and going around the mountain over and over again. And I think another thing he might say is, when you're going on a journey through the wilderness, just take some extra food, right? Take some extra food, because they were always running out of food. And then I think the last thing he would say, just on a practical level before we get into the other practical stuff, is he would say, stop grumbling, right? I mean, if there's one thing that he had to deal with over and over was God's people grumbling. And let's just face it, it is easy to grumble. And we were talking about this in our life group just last couple weeks ago, that just how it's easy. We always kind of lean towards the negative, and it's so easy to do. It's just easy to grumble, So he would say, stop grumbling, just learn to trust God. Stop grumbling about all these things. He's going to provide. But I think the number one thing I think that he would say, out of all the things that he went through, we'll put it up here on the screens, I think Abraham would say, choose faith over safe. What I mean by that is choose to live by faith and stop playing it safe. And we're going to look at why Moses would tell us that, to choose faith over safe. Because there's a lot of reasons why Moses could have chosen just to play it safe. And I think a lot of times when we play it safe, we miss out on what God has in store for us. We miss out on what God has in store for the world and his kingdom when we tend to play it safe. Now, Moses, like I said, he had ample reason, because of things that he went through, to play it safe. Matter of fact, there's one point where he chose to play it safe, but God had other plans. So I want to start going back to Exodus chapter 2, and then what we're going to do is we're going to go through just some practical things this morning, looking at what Hebrews chapter 11 says about this incredible man who's listed in the Hall of Faith. But Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 3, it says this. Just to give you some background here, is that Moses, when he was born, his mom had to hide him because Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, he sees that these Hebrew people are just multiplying like rabbits, right? And basically a bunch of rabbits around the yard right now. I mean, they're just everywhere. We got a bunch of rabbits running around. They're just multiplying like crazy. And now Pharaoh, he forgets about Joseph, who rescued all of Egypt. And he forgets about all these things. This is years later. And now he's feeling fearful that these Hebrews are going to take over the land. So he makes this decision. He says, I want every male child that's born to be killed. We're going to stop this so they have no strength, and we're going to keep them from multiplying like rabbits. So his mom has to hide him. It says when she could no longer hide him, referring to Moses' mother, she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch, and she put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. Now, I want you to think about this for a moment. For a baby, that is traumatic. A baby longs to hear their mother's heartbeats and to be close to them. And when a baby's crying, it needs the comfort and the nurturing of a mom. And she tried to hide him as long as she could, but then she came to the point where she couldn't hide him anymore. He's whining and screaming, whatever was going on there. And so she has to put him in this basket and place him in the river and just hope and pray that he survives it. Now, could you imagine that, being a mom or even a dad and having to do that? That would be traumatic. It would have such an impact on his life as just a little infant even. It goes on. I'll look at verse 10. It says later when the boy was older, referring to Moses, when he was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter. So Pharaoh's daughter finds him. She pulls him out of the water, right? And then she takes him back to his mother and lets him nurse him until he's weaned. And then it says, later on, it says, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, I'd lifted him out of the water. That's what Moses means, drawn up out of the water. So here, he goes from being just abandoned by his mom, unwillingly abandoned, and now he's given up for adoption. His mom can't even keep him. Right? And it's got to have an effect on a kid, right? When they're going through these challenging things from the very start of their life. And then we go on to verse 11. It tells us this. It says, many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. He's probably a teenager, an older teenager at this point. And during his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. Now, what are you going to do when you see somebody messing with your family? You're going to go at him, right? So Moses he sees what's going on, the way they're treating his people. Verse 12, it says, after looking in all directions, making sure nobody's looking, right? What does he do? Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Right? So he's like overreacting, a little bit overkill, Rick says, right? So, I mean, Moses, this is the first instance where we see him losing his cool, right? He's like, this is wrong. You cannot treat my people this way. And so he just takes matters into his own hands, and he goes and he just beats the tar out of this Egyptian and kills him. And then he has to try to cover it up. And that's what we all try to do with our wrongs, try to cover it up, and buries him in the sand. Goes on, 14b. The second part of verse 14 is kind of skipping through some of this. A lot of story here. It says, then Moses was afraid because one of the Hebrews, the second time when he goes out there, he's like, what are you guys doing? He goes, oh, we saw what you did. So he says that Moses was afraid, thinking, everyone knows what I did. Of course they do. Because we can't hide those things, right? Everyone knows what I did. Verse 15, and sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses, what did Moses do? He fled. He ran away. He fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. So now he becomes a fugitive, all because he couldn't control himself. Now you understand why I said take an anger management course? All right? Because we see this over and over again. There's multiple times when Moses just loses his cool. He just doesn't like what people are doing, and he just gets mad, and he blows up, and at this point, he kills an Egyptian. So here, I'm just thinking, Moses at this point in time, he's thinking I've had enough. I've had enough. I went through just being abandoned by my parents unwillingly because of Egypt and Pharaoh and this edict that he put in place. And then I end up being adopted. And it was just hard enough just being ripped away from my mom when I was little. And then I see the way they're treating these Hebrews people, his people, the Hebrews. And so he just takes matters into his own hand. Now he's in big trouble. So now he has to run away. And what Moses decides to do at this point in his journey, he's like, you know what? I'm just going to settle down, and I'm just going to play it safe, and I'm going to take it easy. And he goes to the land of Midian, and he runs into a shepherdess, and then he ends up meeting her dad, Jethro, who's like this prince in Midian, and he just decides he's going to marry his daughter, and he's just going to settle down and live the Midian dream. Just take it easy. No more Egypt, no more stress, no more dealing with all of these people. I'm just going to run away from all this and settle down and play it safe. And you know what happens when God's people try to play it safe? God always has other plans. Because God, as we've looked at in this series, God is after something much bigger in us and through us and for his people and for the world. All right, so what's going on here? I'm going to pick up in Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. It says, one day, Moses is out playing it safe. He's a shepherd now. One day, Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. Now, it's referred to as the mountain of God because that's where later on Moses meets with God, and God gives him the Ten Commandments. So Mount Sinai, we see throughout the Old Testament, is the mountain of God. So he's got this flock of sheep. He's playing it safe. I'm a shepherd. Life is good. I got all that. I'm taking care of them. They're multiplying. Things are good. My life is good. I've settled down. Then verse 2 comes in. It says, there an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. And Moses stared in amazement. Now, I just want you to know something, that sometimes we look at this like, man, that'd be so crazy to see a bush burning on this mountain. That was really a common thing. It's a very hot and dry area. And it would be very common to see a bush burning on fire. All right? Because it's just the region, it's over there, right? But something was very different here. He sees this bush burning in the middle of the bush, and then Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it says it didn't burn up. Now that's going to get your attention, right? It's like, that thing's on fire, but it's not burning up. What's keeping that thing burning? Verse 3, it says, this is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go and see it. Just give you a hint, if you see a bush burning in the wilderness, it might not be God, but it could be. All right? So run towards it. All right? Verse 4, it says, when the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush. And if you ever watched the old movie, The Ten Commandments, you know it sounds like, Moses. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, you remember that movie, right? Moses. Now, I don't really know that God's voice sounded like that. I'm sure it was very practical. God's calling to him, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. I'm sitting there thinking, not here I am, there I was. That bush just talked to me. Not only is it burning, it's on flame, fire, but it's not burning, but now it's talking to me. I would be out of there. But Moses says, here I am. And then God speaks to him. He says, don't come any closer. Do not come any closer. The Lord warned, take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. God's got his attention. Verse 7, it says, then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. Now, I just want to pause here for a moment. I think that's a key verse. God says, look, Moses, I see what's going on. I am completely aware of what's going on with your people and what the Hebrews and all the craziness that's going on in Egypt. And I think God would tell us the same things. Like, look, I see what's going on. I see all the chaos. I see all the brokenness, all the hurting people. And Pastor Rick Warren says over and over again, hurting people hurt people. And we see it happening all over the place. We see all these shootings going on, all the craziness around us in our culture, and just really around the world. And God wants us to know, he says, look, I see it. I see the brokenness. I see the hurting. I see the oppression. And it's the state that sin brings, right? And God says, I see it. I'm not privy, I'm privy to this whole thing. I'm not unaware of it. I hear the cries of distress being cried out. And then it goes on to verse 10, and God says, here's the deal. God says, now go. God's saying, stop playing it safe. Stop running away. Go, for I am sending you. Does that sound familiar? That's what Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 28. He said, go. They're sitting there hanging out. Jesus ascended, and they're sitting there, wow, that was so cool. Like Moses, a burning bush. Man, that's amazing. And the angel says, what are you standing around for? Go, for I'm sending you. And this is what God's telling Moses, I'm sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt. Egypt represents oppression. Egypt represents slavery. Egypt represents our sin. We are bound in our sin. And God sent Moses to set them free. He said, I'm sending you. Stop playing it safe. Choose faith over safe is what God is telling Moses. And when we look at him, it's like, who does God choose to send? Does he send a guy with a perfect past? No. He sends a guy with a messy past. A murderer. One who just keeps losing his cool over and over again. One who could have said, look, man, I've been through a mess growing up. I was abandoned by my parents. You don't think that mattered? And I'm giving up for adoption, and I'm screaming, and my mom's just letting me go, and I'm screaming for her, and I just have to go with this other family, and I'm raised up as an Egyptian, and I see how they're treating my people, and I just lose my cool. I mean, he was damaged goods. And what does God say? Moses, stop playing it safe. I'm sending you. Now go. Go. Rescue my people. Go save those who are hurting. Go and change the world with the good news of what God has done for us through Christ. Now, when I see and I read Moses' life, I can relate to it so much because there's so many times in my own personal journey that I've leaned towards playing it safe. It's like, why would I do this? You know, the reason why I play it safe is because, you know what? I just want to make everybody happy. Right? I'm a people pleaser. I just want to keep everybody happy. And so I'm going to do everything I can to avoid criticism, avoid conflict. You know, and if I can just kind of manage everything just right, you know, I can keep all those plates spinning, keep everybody smiling, everybody happy. And, you know, it's like after a while, it just kind of catches up to you, right? And then what happens when it just kind of boils up? You turn out into a Moses, right? It's like, That's what a control freak is. And there's sometimes where it's just easy to become a control freak because, like, I'm going to do everything I can to play it safe. God says, stop playing it safe. I want you to step out in faith and trust me. And there's been so many times through the years when I've tried to play it safe. When I worked in broadcasting, and then we moved up here to the Greenwood area because we just felt like God was calling us into church planting. But then I got a job in corporate America as an AV engineer for a company up on 116th Street called Telemon. They put all the sun stuff. What are those things called? Reflective panels. I'm blanking my mind. Solar panels. They put all the solar panels in over there at the airport, right, and around the area, right. And so Telemon's a big company, and they had a division that was installing AV systems in federal courtrooms and government courtrooms. And it's like, you know, when you sign on, it's like, man, there's all these bonuses you're going to get. Your division's going to be making all this money, millions of dollar contracts. Minority, it was owned by a Chinese Christian guy. And it was like, so we were getting all these accounts and we're going to be raking in the dough. And it's like, I can't wait till year-end bonus. It's like, man, I could live here. I'm playing it safe. I only lasted 3 months. Didn't even finish my probation. And God said, no more playing it safe. I'm calling you into ministry. And it was just a downward descent. It's like, man, but look at I could have the dream house, I could have the dream life. And God says, no, you're going to take a big pay cut. You're going to have to deal with people. Oh, God, please. Right? And it's so easy to want to play it safe. And God says, no, because God's not after our comfort and our security. God's after our heart more than anything else. And so Moses, I think if he could just step out of the grandstands and come and run one lap with us, he says, let me just kind of talk with you here on how to choose faith over safe, because it's so easy to want to fall into the trap and think that safe is best. And so we're going to look at 4 simple things where I think Moses would say to choose faith over safe. And the first one is, number 1, I think he would say this. He says, choose faith over safe, 1, by letting God define who you are. Now, what I mean by that is it's so easy to just kind of let things in life just kind of define who we become and who we are and get our identity from that. You know, and I could have easily settled in. It's like, you know what, I'm just going to be an audio engineer the rest of my life. And there wasn't anything wrong with that. There wouldn't be anything wrong with doing that at all. It's like I could just do that. I mean, just stay in this corporate job and just kind of live on Easy Street and enjoy it. Even though I hated driving from the south side all the way to the north side every day, all the crazy, especially right now with all the construction traffic, right? So here we look at what Moses is going through, we look at all the things from his past. He really kind of struggled with this identity crisis, just trying to figure out, who am I? Who am I with everything that he went through? And he's probably asking himself, am I Hebrew or am I an Egyptian? Am I a slave or am I free? Am I poor or am I wealthy? And he's probably just trying to wrestle through this whole thing. Am I a murderer or am I a man of God? I mean, it'd be hard to kind of sift through all that emotion and all those thoughts that's going through his mind. So when we look over at Hebrews chapter 11, and it just goes through this whole list of these great men and women of faith, these giants of the faith, it gives us some insight on what Moses went through and how he went about choosing faith over safe. So I'm going to jump over to Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 23. It tells us this. It says, by faith, starts off talking about his parents. Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw that he was no ordinary child. They were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, I'm sitting there thinking about, it's like, okay, what made him so not ordinary, right? I mean, is it just because some babies are cuter than others? No, right? I mean, that'd be crazy, right? Oh, my baby's cuter than yours, right? It's kind of like go back to Joseph, right? I mean, it's like there's something about him. His parents realized there's something about this child, and they wanted to do everything they could to protect him. But then it goes on, it says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Now here he had everything he wanted. I mean, he could have been like Joseph, just saying, you know what, I'm just living the dream. I've got all of the provision of Egypt, being adopted into this Egyptian family. Not just any Egyptian family, but Pharaoh's family. I'm now his grandson by adoption. And I have everything that I want right here at my fingertips. Because grandbabies get everything they want, right? I mean, mine do. Anyway, I treat them better than my kids. Anyway, so it's like, so grandbabies, right? It's like, man, he could have everything that he wanted. I mean, it'd be really a tough decision to try to walk away from that. I mean, one minute you're sitting there thinking, I was born into slavery, but I was adopted into royalty. I mean, how do you walk away from that? That's like a dream come true. Born into slavery, but yet I can live in royalty? How many of you had godparents when you were a kid? Anybody have godparents? A couple of you had godparents. So that if anything happened to your parents, right, you would go and live with your godparents. Now, how many of you played these mind games with yourself? I can imagine Moses going through this identity crisis. I remember as a kid, once I figured out who my godparents were, I was told, I'm sitting there thinking, man, I'm a city boy, and they live in the country. And they got all these acres, right? And my cousins, we called them aunt and uncle, even though they were my mom and dad's best friends, and they were more like family than real family. We spent a lot of time with them. And so we called their kids our cousins, and their grandmother had horse farm and all these horses, right? There was a barn. There was a 1929 Ford tractor. I get to ride that thing. I mean, we have all this land, all this stuff to plan. They had motorcycles, dirt bikes. And what do I have? I just live in this little house in the city. I'm sitting there thinking, man, could something just happen to my mom and dad so I go live with them? Come on now, don't tell me you never had these thoughts. Like, what would it be like if I could go live over there? I mean, we always have this thought, the grass is greener on the other side, right? I mean, my parents disciplined me. They probably wouldn't discipline me, right? I could just run around in the fields and just live this great life, with my godparents, right? I'm sitting there thinking that's probably what Moses was thinking. This tension, it's like, man, I have everything right here at my fingertips. Why would I walk away from that? I'm the grandson of Pharaoh by adoption. That would be so hard. And at some point, Moses had to decide, answering the question, who am I? And I think the same thing comes for us. I think we need to ask ourselves the same question. We'll just put this up here on the screens. I think I put it in notes. Who or what are you letting define you? Who or what are you letting define who you are? What defines who you are? I think we should be able to answer that question. Who am I? What defines who I am? Is it my status? Is it my job? Is it peers? The people I hang out with? Peer pressure? Social media? Is it my career? I mean, there's so many things. I mean, what is it that defines who we are? And Moses is wrestling through this. He's got to choose what he's going to live by, what his identity is going to be. And so I think Moses would say, choose faith over safe by letting God be the one to define you. And we see it worded in different ways in the New Testament. Let's jump over to Romans chapter 12, verse 2. It tells us this: do not be shaped by this world. Instead, be changed within. Remember I said God's after our heart. He's after a changed life. Be changed within by a new way of thinking. Then you'll be able to decide what God wants for you. And you'll be able to know what is good and pleasing to God and what is perfect. In other words, it's letting God define who we are. That's what Moses, if he could just come run alongside, it's like, look, let God define who you are. Not all these things that you could have and all these things you could become. In Exodus 23, this is what God had Moses write down. I thought, man, how fitting for him what he went through and just trying to understand who he was. Exodus 23 verse 2 says this. It says, you must not follow the crowd in doing wrong when you are called to testify in a dispute. Do not be swayed by the crowd to twist justice. Now, why would God have to state that? Because it's so easy to do, right? When the majority of all the people in a culture say, hey, this is what we want, it's hard going against that, isn't it? This is how we want to live. This is what we want. It's hard going against this. And God says, look, don't flow. Don't go with the flow. Don't go with the crowd. When you know something's wrong, stand up for what is right. Don't let the world define who you are. Let God define who you are. And I think we live in a time where there's just so much pressure and it's hard living out our faith as Christ followers. And I think Moses, if he could just come out of the grandstands and run a lap with us, he'd say, look, choose faith over playing it safe when it comes to understanding who you are, let God define who you are. And I think a second thing he would say, not only would say that, understanding who we are, but by taking the hard path over the easy path. Because it's so much easier taking the easy path, right? I mean, Moses said, look, I'm out of here. I'm going to go live in the land of Midian. It's not that bad being a shepherd. I can make a career out of being a shepherd and just enjoy my life. But then God shows up and says, no, I've got something much bigger in store for you than have to spend all day listening to bad jokes, right? So he says, take the hard path over the easy path. Let's go back to Hebrews 11. Verse 25, it goes on. It talks about Moses, that he, referring to Moses, he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. Now, when I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about it, it's like, man, that is a tough decision. Right? Chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy all the pleasures that he had in Egypt. And many of those things were just sinful things. And Moses clearly understood that sin only lasts for a short time. The pleasures of sin only last for a brief moment. And then they're over. Even when you think about a lifetime. He could have lived growing up in Egypt and had access to everything, but he knew that it would only be a brief moment when it comes to all of eternity. So he's willing just to walk away from all of that. But I'm sitting there thinking, man, that would be so hard to do. And I think sometimes when we think about the pleasures of sin, we think of the bad things that we do, right? I mean, there's all these things that come to mind, the pleasures of sin. You know, I could go out, I could smoke and drink, and do all these crazy things, and I'm not talking about drugs and all this stuff. I could do all these things because, man, it just made me feel really good for this moment, right? But then you got to keep going back, right? Because it's only temporary. It's not going to satisfy. Nothing ever satisfied except for God. He's the only one that can satisfy us. And so many times when we think of sinful pleasures, we always think of bad things. But James, Jesus' brother, tells us something different. I want to jump to this verse here in James chapter 4, verse 17. I think this is why Moses would say, stop playing it safe. Because in James chapter 4, verse 17, it says this. It says, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. Now, that's a different perspective on sin, isn't it? And what God's word says, we know there's a lot of things that we should be doing. The things that God called us to. I mean, God spoke to Moses from the burning bush. He said, look, go, I'm sending you. What was his first reaction? He said, here I am. But then after, that was when God first spoke to him. But then after God said, I'm sending you, then what did Moses do? He's like, get someone else. Maybe my brother Aaron. He's a better speaker than I am. He started trying to find a way out of it. He said, no, I'm sending you. And Moses kept, contending with God. He said, well, maybe, I just do better if I had somebody else with me. And so then finally he said, okay, your brother's coming now, and I'm sending you both back. But you are my prophet. You are the one that I'm going to send before Pharaoh. And Moses, he wanted to play it safe. And I think what God's word tells us is we know that there's things we're supposed to be doing. And if Moses would have said, no, I refuse to go, that would have been wrong. He would have been disobeying God, what God called him to do. And I think it's just a good perspective for us to remember when God's saying, stop playing it safe and live by faith, is that there's things that he's charged us as his church to do for the kingdom. And we know things we're supposed to be doing. And yet James says when we fail to do it, it's actually sin. It's disobedience towards God because we've made safety an idol over faith. And it's easy to live by safe than living by faith. Matter of fact, in the New Testament, Jesus puts it this way in Matthew 16, verse 25. He says this. He says, if you try to hang onto your life, you will lose it. If you try to play it safe, it's not going to work out. You're going to lose it. He says, but if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what he's saying is he's after our heart. He's after our willingness to surrender to him and say, look, I'm willing just to let you lead me, lead my life. No matter what our career is. We talked about last week, God purposely and intentionally puts us where we are to advance his kingdom. And Jesus says, if you try to hang on to your life, try to play it safe, you're going to miss out on all the things that God has in store for you. So he's saying, Moses would say, look, stop playing it safe. Take the hard path. Choose the hard path. Get your identity from God, not the things of this world that are so alluring. Take the hard path over the easy path. I think the third thing he would say to choose faith over safe, number 3, is by embracing God values over what culture values. Now, the challenge that we live in this world is there is a clash of kingdoms. We are spiritual beings created in the image of God. You heard me teach on this. And God's kingdom, when Jesus comes on the scene, the kingdom of God comes in power. God's rule and reign. That's what his kingdom is. His rule and reign. And you know who Jesus gave the rule and reign, the keys to the kingdom to? His church, his people. And he commissioned us to go as ministers of this good news of Christ to the world that desperately needs us. And so when we sit there and we watch the news and we see all this craziness, and the media just loves it. They're never going to waste an opportunity when there's a murder, when there's shootings, when there's tragedy. But wouldn't it be great if they just spent more time focusing on all the great things that are going on in the world instead of glamorizing sin and brokenness? But start focusing on God and the things of God and his kingdom. And that's where the church has got to come in. Because only a changed heart is going to change a nation. And the church, guys, we have a job to do. People are hurting everywhere. Doesn't matter how many laws you change. It's not going to take away sin. It's not going to take away rebellion. And so we got to do our part in rescuing as many people as we can. And so Moses, he would say, embrace God values over what culture values, because there's always going to be this clash of kingdoms. In Hebrews 11, verse 26, it says this, says, he, Moses, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. And once again, I'm sitting there thinking about this, and when you read this in Hebrews 11, it's just so countercultural. It just goes against everything inside of us. Why would I choose to be mistreated when I could have everything and anything I wanted? When I could live in safety, I could live in luxury, I could live in royalty. Why would I choose disgrace for the sake of Christ? And the reason why it says for the sake of Christ is because when it says the angel of the Lord had appeared in the burning bush, Bible scholars believe that that was the pre-incarnate Christ. Jesus before he was born into humanity as being both fully God and fully man. In his pre-incarnate state, the angel of the Lord. So he regards disgrace for the sake of Christ as a greater value than all the treasures that he had access to in Egypt because of where his focus was. And that's what Hebrews 11 and 12 is all about. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, who is the pioneer and perfecter of faith, because there's times when we're running the race, we're going to get tripped up. There's going to things that are just going to weigh us down, and all the problems, all the craziness, the chaos that's in this world can just throw us off course. And so we're doing this series because we need these guys and women and men that have gone before us, these giants of the faith, to just spur us on to live this thing out. And Moses is screaming. He says, look, choose faith over safe. And I think for us as Christ followers today in our culture it's getting increasingly more and more difficult because we are bigoted, biased people. Because we believe in something that just goes against culture. It goes against the grain of what most people believe. And we got to hold to that. It's not that we got to be jerks about it. We got to express and extend the hands and feet of Jesus, the love of God, and rescue as many people as we can. And I was reading a commentary this week, and it talks about Moses. It says that Moses habitually looked away from the treasures of Egypt and fixed his eyes on his heavenly reward. Now, to do that, you have to understand, for Moses, he was putting himself in a position where all the wrath of the power of the most powerful man in the world was going to come down on him. Now, that'd be a really hard decision to make. The most powerful man in the world, Pharaoh, all of his wrath is going to come down on him if he chooses the values of what God says over the values of what Egypt says. What culture that he's living in says is what's of value. Because Pharaoh was as a god to the Egyptians, and so to go against that was just a huge clash of kingdoms and cultures. And when all that pressure is on you, it's just easy to give in, and it's just easy to play it safe. So Moses would say, look, you got to determine what your values are. Matter of fact, let me just ask you that question. If I were just to ask you, it's actually in the life group notes this week. What are your top 3 values? And you should be able to answer that question. What are your top 3 values? Because whether you realize it or not, every one of us, we live out our lives based on what we value. Every decision we make is based on our values. What we do, where we go, how we do it, when we do it, it's all based on a value system that we've bought into. And culture's got all kinds of values that are out there. And if you don't know and you don't settle before God what your values are, the world's going to determine what your values are. And that's why us, as Christ followers, we got to know what our values are. Now I think about Moses, and he's caught in this tension. What am I going to live for? I have everything that I want here. And I'm sitting there thinking about, it's like Moses could have been Mr. Popular. Growing up as a grandson of Pharaoh, he had everything, and he could just been walking through the streets and be like, oh, Moses, right? Instead of maybe a lot different voice, like, Moses, oh, Moses, you're the best, you're the greatest, Moses. And people would kneel to him, they'd kiss his ring because he was someone special. The paparazzi would be there, taking pictures. I mean, there'd be all these pleasures and all this glamour and all this stuff. I mean, he could have even possibly had a line to the throne, become Pharaoh himself someday. He could have had it all. And you know what? In a short period of time, nobody would even remember who he was. Do you know who the last Pharaoh of Egypt was? I don't. Who cares, right? Rick says, who cares, right? But think about this. I mean, Moses had an opportunity, he had a choice he had to make. What values am I going to choose? Because if I embrace Egypt, I can have it all, and maybe I'll be famous, and everybody around the world will know who I am. And you know what? Because he chose God values, everybody around the world does know who he is. Because Moses' name is known on every continent of this planet. Because he chose to embrace the values of God and his kingdom over the values of an earthly kingdom. And through this broken man, God gave us the first 5 books of the Bible. He gives us the 10 Commandments, which radically changed human history. When God says, here's the law to live by. Here's the difference between right and wrong. And you know what? Mankind's been fighting against it ever since. Because we want all the pleasures of this world, but Moses chose God and his values. And so if Moses could step down out of the grandstand and just run one lap with us, he would say, look, don't be defined by this world. Choose faith over safe by letting God define who you are. By taking the hard path over the easy path. By choosing God values over what culture values. And the 4th thing he would say, choose faith over safe by not letting fear determine your future. Because I'm telling you guys, it's easy, man. When God shows up and there's a burning bush, you're like, whoa, this is God. It's like, yeah, I'll do anything. We have these aha moments, right? These defining moments in our life. And, we come to church and we can get all pumped up. It's like, let's do it. Let's go change the world. But then all of a sudden it's like, reality sets in, right? And I want to do this thing. We have this intention inside us, what we want to do, but then there's this whole thing called fear that kind of paralyzes us. Because when you go on social media, I mean, people are just downright mean and hateful. And it's just being stirred more and more in our culture. There's just a lot of bitterness and a lot of hatred. And if there's one thing this world needs, they need Jesus. They need to know who the real Jesus is. And let me tell you this. Jesus didn't play it safe. He let it all go. He poured his life out on a cross. And that's the same thing he calls us to. And it's fearful and it's scary. But Moses, if he could step down out of the grandstands, he'd say, look, guys, choose faith over safe. Goes on, Hebrews 11, verse 27. It says, by faith, Moses left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. This is after he's leading God's people out of Egypt. And the king is angry. Why is he angry? Because God sent plague after plague after plague. And you know what Pharaoh said? He says, no, I'm not letting go. I am in control. I am the most powerful man in the world, and I'm not giving in to anyone. And some God that you're mentioning, I'm not going to give in to him. And then finally, God said, put the blood over your doorposts. And whoever doesn't have that blood over that Passover, from the Passover lamb, doesn't have that blood over your doorpost, their firstborn son is going to die. And guess what? Pharaoh said, that's a bunch of baloney. And guess what? His firstborn died. And now he is mad as a hornet, and he's coming with vengeance, and all the wrath and all the power of Egypt now is chasing down Moses and God's people. And it says, by faith, Moses left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who he couldn't see. Now that's crazy, isn't it? He saw him who is invisible. Really, you're going to follow that? Something that you can't see, someone that you can't see, you're going to follow that? You better believe I'm going to follow it, because I heard his voice, Moses, speak from that burning bush. I saw a bush burning, and it was on fire, but it wasn't burning. I saw some crazy stuff, and I saw those plagues come, and I'm trusting in the power and the might of the God of this, who's over everything, the most powerful creature in all of history, the God of all creation. And what his natural eye couldn't see, his faith could see. He saw with spiritual eyes. And he trusted in the one who he knew could rescue him and deliver him from all of the wrath and power of Egypt. And so if Moses could come out of the grandstands and run one lap with us, he would say, church, stop playing it safe. Choose faith over safe. God said, go, for I'm sending you. He may not be sending you to Pharaoh, but he's sending you to someone. Someone in your neighborhood, someone in your workplace, someone who's hurting. When was the last time you shared your faith with somebody? When was the last time you prayed for somebody that wasn't a believer? I think each and every one of us, we need to be challenged in this, even me. We need to be challenged. Moses would say, go in faith. Choose faith over safe. Amen.